Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Here on our panel, the Conservative MEP and committed Brexiteer, Daniel Hannan. Jean Freeman, formerly a communist activist, then Labour Party advisor, now the SNP's Minister for Social Security. The former leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Kezia Dugdale. The senior editor at The Economist and veteran Westminster watcher Anne McElvoy. And flying the flag for a socialist Britain, The Guardian columnist Owen Jones. Thank you very much. Now, remember, if you're a regular watcher, you can, of course, take issue with the panel and with the audience using hashtag BBCQT on either Twitter or Facebook, or you can text us on 83981, and if you push the red button, you may discover what other people are texting. Our first question from Alice Miller, please. Alice Miller.
Can we ever change the behaviour and culture of predatory men who use sexual abuse to exert their power?
Right. Can we ever change the behaviour of predatory men? Well, we know what you're talking about. Jean Freeman.
I think the main people who need to take responsibility for changing that behaviour are other men. I am increasingly depressed by the notion that sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexism, which happens across our country in not just in the media or in newsrooms or in corridors of power, but in shops and offices right across the land. I'm increasingly depressed at the notion that this is somehow women's problem and that we need to do something to fix it. I think it is crystal clear now. This is about the attitudes and behaviour of men who think they have an entitlement to take what they want, when they want, and the people who need to change that are men. And that is why I was really pleased that in our Scottish Parliament, it was the senior male politician in government who stood up and made that point. That men need to challenge each other, they need to be much less tolerant of, the locker room chat, the casual jokes, the casual comments, and the belittling of women in every single respect. If we simply look at how we deal with female politicians, why are we so obsessed with what a woman is wearing when she's a politician? Maybe it's because, frankly, what men wear when they're politicians is pretty boring, I'll give you that. But that is not the kind of behaviours that really says to young women and girls in particular, be what you can be. The opportunities are there for you, and we will open the doors for you. We're not saying that with honesty if we're also saying to them, but as soon as you stick your head up, we're going to try and undermine you and belittle you. That won't do.
Anne McElvoy.
Well, yes, I think it is changing. I think it's changing very fast, and we're seeing it change this week. We've got the proof before us. The House of Commons, and I started writing about, thank you very much, David, for the word veteran. But it's a different place. And I think what has happened is that now, when we take the fact that we've had the most senior resignation, really, that we could imagine from this, of the Secretary of State for Defence, Michael Fallon. Now, even 10 years ago, that would have been one of those he says, she says, it would have hung around a bit. He would have tried to hang on. He would probably have had the Prime Minister's support for longer. And it's just a sign that the mores, the way that we think about how men should behave to women as a norm in politics is changing. And I have to say, not just in politics. I have a bit of carry on Westminster. It needs to end. And all these excuses about, well, it's flirtation, it's banter. There are lines, and we need to police those lines much more. And I think that has certainly come across this week to political class. I was just about to say, I'm a bit wary about saying this is only about sleazy politicians. The media world that I joined, apparently back in the Punic Wars, according to David.
The veteran just means you've been doing it for a bit. It doesn't mean you're age-old.
Thank you. I'm better already. But it really has changed, and it needs to change more. I absolutely take Jean's point. It is also the job of men to change that, just as much of women. We've got out of the way of thinking of it as just the feminist cause that the blokes put up with.
What do you make of what Sir Michael Fallon said? What might have been acceptable 15 or 10 years ago, that's not very long ago, is clearly not acceptable now. Do you think that's a legitimate justification for his behaviour 10 or 15 years ago?
No, I don't. I think he was trying, to some extent, to be frank. I'm going to give him a little benefit of the doubt. I think he was trying to explain how he'd got himself into this mess. He's an intelligent man. He's a very experienced politician. He was supposed to be the safe pair of hands. That, you know, maybe an unfortunate phrase in the circumstances. But I think what is wrong with it is it wasn't acceptable then. It's just he didn't know it. And that is what annoys people. And I think if you say to people who have that view, did you really, would you have liked your daughter to go into politics or go into any profession and necessarily, feel that they sometimes had to sort of fend off kind of, lusty men around the office when there was, they were not really putting themselves in the way of trying to go out on a date with you. I think that is a line that we've just changed our understanding of that. Sometimes people make excuses, but when you ask them if they'd like their own children to come up against it when they go into the workplace or start to enter adult life, they're much more stringent. I think that's good.
Let's hear from one or two members of the audience before we go on. Alice, you yourself, what's your view?
I think it'll take a long time. I think it'll take generations to actually change.
And you, sir?
It's not just entirely men that causes this problem. When I was at sea, I sailed with a stewardess who had retired out of the RAF, who had been based at Chequers, and she used to tell us that she used to lick her lips when the new recruits come into the building.
All right. I don't know. Don't we want to go into that one? You sir up there.
What I can't understand is a lot of the recent furore over what has been happening is historical. And you would ask yourself why the people concerned haven't come forward before now. Some of that is because they've been in fear of their livelihoods or their jobs or whatever it might be. But I thought that we had a charter, a whistleblower's charter, that never seems to have been upheld, and therefore the people concerned have never felt that they've got any support.
Owen Jones.
Well, look, we live in a society which is still riddled and defined in lots of ways by sexism and misogyny. And the point you just made there, it is so hard for survivors of sexual violence to come forward. And there's the sense of it's my word against theirs. It's the abuse of male power, this belief that, the sense of entitlement people have, a sense that their career could be jeopardised as a consequence, that their sexual history will be trawled over, that they will be demonised and attacked in court and all the rest. The truth is, in Britain, men who assault, harass and rape women get away with it. 1.4 million women every single year suffer from domestic violence. 400,000 are sexually assaulted and 90,000 are raped. And the vast majority of those cases, there is absolutely no justice whatsoever. But the answer to the first question has to be this. The only way we ever got change was courageous women, the women's movement, struggling for the rights of women against entrenched misogyny and sexism. And that's how all the rights we have in law, when it comes to protecting women, have been achieved, that the transformation of male attitudes, which still has a long way to go, was because of the struggle of women. But my fear in Parliament, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, Labour and Labour's own particular independent inquiry into a horrendous rape of Bex Bailey, an incredibly courageous young woman. My worry with the Conservative Party at the moment was a briefing in the Sunday Times this week, which suggested the new Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, had given regular briefings to Theresa May about sexual harassment by her cabinet ministers and MPs. And the question has to be there, why wasn't it acted on? Was it used to try and keep their loyalty, to scare them into believing that it would be exposed rather than acting on it? Did the whips fail to act? And because if the government of this country takes a blind eye to sexual harassment, what message does that send to the rest of the country when male violence against girls and women is so rampant? They have to set an example, and that means cleaning up politics in this country to show that sexism and misogyny has to be consigned to the scrap heap of history forever.
First of all, I think what's happened, particularly to Bexley, was abhorrent. I think the violence and harassment against women is abhorrent, but I think we have to be very, very careful to create a society where all men are viewed by women as a potential predator, and that all women could therefore just be seen as a victim. Particularly in the case of Michael Fallon, the journalist herself said that she did not feel that she was a victim. She felt that she dealt with it at the time. She spoke to him. He didn't do it again, and that was the end of it. And I think we have to make a clear distinction about the cases of Bex Bailey and women who are threatened, who are harassed, who are made to feel inferior and scared, and men who I would just say chance their arm and get, a hand away. I think there has to be a clear distinction. I don't think you can legislate for what I would call perhaps leche or not particularly pleasant behaviour, because I think if you equate violence, rape, harassment with somebody potentially touching a knee, if you say they're the same thing, then I think it belittles the argument.
Okay. Kezia Dugdale, do you agree with her?
I do, yes. Let me say something about Bex Bailey in a second, but address the point about Michael Fallon first. I mean, seriously, if Michael Fallon has resigned, and we're told we have to believe that he has resigned because he touched a woman's knee 10 years ago, there won't be a single Tory minister left come Sunday. This is about a culture that permeates politics, and we are all looking at our parliaments now, but we are kidding ourselves if this isn't happening in every single workplace across the country today. I know of constituents, young mums working part-time, who are scared to speak up when their boss slaps them on the bum because they know they'll lose their job. This is the type of thing that's happening in women's everyday lives, and it's been exposed in our politics just now. I know Bex Bailey, I know her quite well, and I spoke to somebody who's looking after her just now, because right enough she's turned her phone off. She doesn't want to speak to journalists anymore. She feels she's done her bit. But if Bex was here tonight, I tell you what she would say. She would say, listen to what she actually said in that interview on the radio. She doesn't want this to be about her or about individual women like her. She wants it to be about how we change the culture now. And she is begging politicians and people in power to learn the lessons of what happened to her. And the one thing she's asking for is independent reporting of sexual harassment. You should not have to phone your boss or somebody who is in a more powerful position than you to report this type of behaviour. You have to trust the system, because what is happening just now is women feel three things. One, that they won't be believed. Two, that no action will be taken. And perhaps the worst of all, that they'll be marked as trouble. This isn't about the women, it's about the culture, and it's high time we changed it.
The focus just now is on Westminster, and there is obviously a problem there, but given the fact that there's a correlation between alcohol consumption and sexual misconduct, shouldn't a step be taken in Westminster and in Holyrood to ban the sale or supply of alcohol within those premises, like every other workplace in the country?
Okay. Someone just behind you, yes.
I think it's very important that we remember it isn't just women that are affected by sexual harassment. Men are as well. Every day in the workplace, anywhere, women can be as sleazy, inappropriate and violent as some men can. But it's even harder for men, a lot of men, to come forward and state that they have been harassed or they have been assaulted, because there's an even bigger stigma attached to it. I mean, so many people see it as a woman can't attack a man can attack a woman, that's accepted. But a man cannot be attacked by a woman, because clearly he's a man.
And
that needs to be remembered.
Are you saying men are attacked not by other men, but are sexually harassed by women?
Yes, it does happen, and it's overlooked. A man sexually harassed by a woman, no matter how he feels, if he likes it or if he dislikes it, other guys are like, oh, and you go, get in, good on you. But really, that man could be sitting, and I've actually met somebody who was really, really traumatised by a woman that had been constantly having a go. She's like, oh, we're just having a laugh. And he said to her, please stop, I'm not enjoying it.
Okay.
He ended up leaving.
Okay. Daniel Hannan.
Well, the question was, are attitudes improving? Can they be improved? And I think the answer has to be yes. I mean, my daughters, when they enter the workplace, will not be entering a workplace with the same sorts of attitudes that my mother faced when she did, let alone going back further to before, when women had equal rights in law and when even violence against women could be sanctioned legally. So plainly there is an arc bending in the right direction. But there's obviously something unpleasant about having a workplace atmosphere, and I agree with what everyone has said, that this isn't just about politics, we've seen it in the church, in the media, in the private sector. There's something unpleasant about a workplace where women feel on edge, either because of banter or because of behaviour that they think they don't, exactly what Kez just said, that they don't want to look like troublemakers. And that's a nasty atmosphere for everyone. I mean, obviously, most directly for the women concerned, but it makes for a bad atmosphere for everyone. So I think we all have a reason for wanting to get on top of it. I think the PM was right to recognise that this is a cross-party issue. I think she was right to to grip it by the throat and to say we need to do something quickly about this, and credit to the other party leaders also for treating it that way. I'd add one important thing, though. We need to distinguish between, as the lady over here says, between the levels of severity and also between the levels of accuracy. I say this as someone who you know, I've written over the years for the Daily Telegraph, which did, I think, great service when it exposed the Westminster expenses scandal. But there was a real flaw in how it did that, in that it tended to jumble everything together, from the criminal behaviour to the extravagant behaviour to the just slightly eccentric behaviour, as though it was all the same. There was no hierarchy of wrongdoing. And I think we need to be very careful not to do the same here. I think we recognise that there is a difference between abusing a position of authority, or, in extreme case, actual sexual assault, and making a louche pass at somebody, or being discourteous, or being clumsy. And it's also important to remember that the severity of an accusation doesn't reverse the burden of proof. There is sometimes a temptation with particular allegations, because of the nature of the allegations, that everyone kind of draws back and the presumption of innocence is reversed. There are, in this dossier that was circulating among the staffers, there seem to be some cases that are just straightforwardly false. And I think it is worth remembering that the presumption of innocence is not just some piety, it has to mean something.
Okay. Just before we leave this, hierarchy of wrongdoing. Do you agree there's a hierarchy of wrongdoing, as Daniel just said?
Well, I agree with what Kezia said, in that there is clearly a difference between sexually motivated talk and harassment and sexual violence and rape. There is clearly a difference. But I'm not sure I do agree with Daniel, because what you described to me in terms of the expenses scandal was actually at its core an abuse of power. And I think whether or not it is sexual harassment in the terms of language and intimidating behaviour, or it is sexual violence, it is an abuse of power. And therefore, whilst you might take different solutions to that, you know, there is criminal behaviour at one end and other behaviour at the other end, nonetheless, the core of it is a belief that a group of people are lesser than you and that you have an entitlement to exercise power over that group of people. And I think, in response to what the young lady in the audience said about when men are harassed, my attitude is simple. Harassing and intimidating and abusing anyone is unacceptable, but we are clear that the vast majority of people who have to deal with that day in and day out are women. And that is what all of this is exposing. Now, it's not just about one individual or another individual. It's about attitudinal and behavioural change. And it has to absolutely be led by those of us who are elected to make laws. We need to have a particularly high standard of our own behaviour, but it needs to permeate all the way through our society, so that in those factories and shops and all the rest of it, it's changed there too. And the leaders of that, in all honesty, need to be men supporting the women who speak out.
I'll take one last point, then we must go on.
I suspect that Michael Fallon knows that his behaviour was unacceptable 10, 15 years ago, but that it wasn't perhaps, the issue wasn't out there in the media spotlight and under scrutiny, and others are obviously involved as well, so I think that's why he has chosen to resign.
OK. Let's go on to another question. Just before we do, we're going to be in Croydon next week, and the week after that we're in Newcastle, and on the screen now, if you want to just make a note of our email address and our phone number. I'll give it all again at the end. But anyway, it's Croydon next week and Newcastle the week after. So if you want to come, you'll be extremely welcome. Alistair Bell, let's have your question, please. Alistair Bell.
8 Catalan ministers have been jailed. Does the panel agree that Spain is behaving like a fascist state?
Wow. Catalonia. Eight of the Catalan devolution ministers were jailed today. Is Spain behaving like a fascist state? Owen Jones.
Well, certainly as a very authoritarian, anti-democratic state, to say the least. Look, it doesn't matter whether you support Catalan independence. It really is actually quite irrelevant. The issue is, do you support the right of the Catalan people to freely determine their own future without being dragged from polling stations and thrown downstairs? And in modern Europe, to see an elected Catalan, an elected political leadership, fleeing a country to claim political asylum and being locked up in prisons should chill every single European and encourage us to stand in solidarity with the Catalan people. Look, I think this is a bit like the right to divorce. Just because you support the right to divorce doesn't mean you think everybody should get divorced. But imagine you've got a married couple and one of them said, you know what, I'm having second thoughts about this. Not sure it's working out. I'm thinking about a divorce. And the response of the partner is, how dare you, screaming in their face, vetoing any talk of a divorce and making their life increasingly hellish. In a sense, the right to national self-determination is similar. I don't happen to support Catalan independence myself, but I do think they have a basic democratic right to determine whether an independent state or not. If Scotland had been denied the right to determine its own future, that would have been a democratic outrage. And in modern Europe today, the least that the other European governments can do is tell the Spanish government, stop assaulting voters, stop locking up elected politicians, stop denying the right of your people to determine their own future, and stop attacking civil liberties. And whatever you think about independence, that should be something that unites all of us, I think.
Daniel Hannan.
I feel so lucky that I live in a country where this kind of thing is unthinkable. And just imagine if something similar had been the response when the issue of Scottish independence was put. Just imagine if David Cameron had responded to Alex Salmond not by sitting down and discussing the terms of the question and the franchise and all, but by having him arrested, you know. Imagine that police had been sent in to break up the poll. Or even, before you get there, imagine London politicians saying we need to anglicise Scotland in the way that a PP former minister in Madrid was saying we need to españolizar a los catalanes. Right? It's an almost unthinkable situation. I'm very, very pleased that we live in a country where we're bound together by shared values, but where it's clearly understood that it's a democracy and that you're free to leave. And do you know what? When you're free to leave, you're in no hurry to exercise that right. If we saw people coming in and locking the doors around us in this studio, our first instinct would be to get up and try and get out, wouldn't it? And that's, in a sense, the position...
You're locked in, actually. You can't get out.
I'm off right now. But I say this as someone, you know, I'm deeply Hispanophile, and most of my Spanish friends and colleagues are, you know, conservatives and are unionists. But for the last 3 years, I've watched with increasing bewilderment as they've created a problem that previously wasn't there. If there had been a referendum 3 or 4 years ago, all the indications are that it would have gone in favour of the status quo.
Isn't there danger? Isn't there a reality that it's against the Spanish Constitution to have a referendum?
So, change the constitution, or at least provide a mechanism where constitutional change is possible. I mean, the compromise here is so obvious and is supported in all the polls. You can give Catalonia more autonomy within a continuing union. Vast majority of Catalans say that that's their preferred option. Most Castilian Spanish people say that that would be the acceptable way out of the crisis. It's just extraordinary that this pig-headedness, this stubbornness on both sides, I have to say, has made that kind of outcome so difficult.
You say in the white shirt there.
You say all this, but you support a government that still backs Spain's position. So are you going to lobby the government to change their position on the Spanish stance at the moment?
Well, there's one thing is, what should be the position of recognising an independent Catalonia? I think it would be wrong for other governments to start interfering in the internal affairs of a friendly country.
Dan, just quickly, it's a lot worse than that. Look, we had scenes of voters dragged from polling station and thrown downstairs, firefighters being attacked by the Spanish police. It's not just, we're not saying they should recognise Catalan independence. We're saying, or I think some people in the audience probably think this, that they should condemn attacks on human rights and the democratic rights of the Catalan people.
I'm very happy.
It's a simple
You make a point. Let him
I've had this conversation. I've said privately what I'll happily say now publicly to my Spanish Conservative friends. I think this is not only a morally wrong behaviour, it is also intellectually wrong. It's foolish because they are making much more likely the outcome that they supposedly
I think the point is whether you make the point to your British Conservatives, not the Spanish Conservatives.
Well, but what do we... I mean, the government... The only thing practically that the government could do would be to take a different position on whether Catalonia should become independent. No, I don't think it should do that. I think it should be neutral on that.
Why did they just condemn the attacks on democracy? It's very straightforward.
Well, but I think they have said that there was excess force.
They haven't condemned the Spanish government for a thing they've done, not a single thing.
All right, Jean.
Nothing.
Owen is absolutely right. And, you know, I appreciate what you say about the country that we live in and the way in which the proposition for a referendum in Scotland was negotiated. And I give credit to both the UK and the Scottish Government for doing that. But we cannot appreciate that and yet turn our faces away from a situation in Spain where that is not the case. And our government does have an obligation, as a friend of Spain, to say, you really do need to uphold excuse me, democratic rights and allow people to determine the road that they want to go down. And to make it worse, day by day, I am almost speechless when I see the next step that the Spanish government takes. And now to jail elected politicians, not sacked politicians, elected politicians, to put them in jail. And to believe that that is a way to resolve a difference seems to be utter madness. That, frankly, is a way in which those differences will increase
You've got members of your party who've signed a motion saying that Scotland should recognise Catalonia and its independence. SNP wants independence from the UK. Do you support them? Do you think the SNP should take up a position of saying we're in favour of an independent Catalonia?
I understand why members of my own party have signed that motion, but perhaps they don't know that as a Scottish Government we don't have the powers to recognise anything internationally. What we can do and are doing is urging the Spanish Government to uphold human rights and democracy and hoping that the UK government and the union that we are still part of will do exactly the same, because that is the right thing to do, regardless of your view on independence, human rights and democracy.
The woman on the left there, yes, on the gangway, yes.
Every country in Europe should be condemning Spain. The way the Guardia went in, it was an absolute disgrace. We've had a house there for 26 years, and people that we know were pulled out of the polling station and not allowed to vote. It's a disgrace.
Amen. And you said at the very back there on the left.
While I agree with Owen, and the scenes that we've seen, totally unacceptable, and while probably at some point Catalonia will get the opportunity
to vote for that. It was an illegal vote. And when that vote does come along, which it probably will, and if it is a no, as in where the polls are suggesting at the moment, will the Catalan nationalists accept that no? Unlike the Scottish nationalists don't accept the no at the moment.
Okay. And you, sir, there. The man behind you, the man in the pink shirt there, yes.
As you and the other gentleman said, that the Catalonia independence referendum was unconstitutional and illegal. The actions taken by the Spanish government were completely reprehensible. All they needed to do was say that since this wasn't part of the constitution, the vote was void, and there would have been far less trauma and lashback from this than the actions they did take.
Anne McElroy.
I think it's, it is right, but also a bit too easy to simply go down the line of condemnation. We can all condemn what we saw happen because we wouldn't want to see it in our own countries. And having cut my teeth cutting the old East Germany and covering authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, it has resonances which I think are deeply unpleasant. But the facts are that there is not an overall appetite in Catalonia for independence. And sometimes the debate is conducted as if there were. And sometimes some of the framing of news reporting seems to suggest that there is. And there is not. This referendum was not held in a way that was appropriate. The road to it was not the one that would have been taken in the sense of, we talked earlier about, or referred to, the Scottish referendum. It is a sign of what happens if you go down roads which are secessionary rather than pro-independence. If you want a legitimate pro-independence movement, then go out there, campaign for it, get people on your side. That, I think, would have shown up Madrid and the unbending stance, overly so, of Mr. Rajoy, the Prime Minister, so much more than this slightly fly-by-night movement, which I don't think has covered itself in glory. Now is the time for both sides to step back. The push for independence is, I think, over for the moment. There will be a chance in elections in December, I think, to begin to redraw the relationship. Personally, I'm for greater autonomy along the Basque model, but I think the way to do it is not this. We've seen a hot-headed conflict, and it's had very bad results.
Okay.
To be fair, I think they did try. I mean, I happened to be in Barcelona talking to what they call their foreign minister the day before they announced the referendum. And he talked me through the ways in which he tried to negotiate with Madrid to get something that may have been on a vote on something short of full independence. And there was a kind of aggressive authoritarian legalism from Madrid, an absolute refusal to discuss it, which I think was hugely unproductive.
All right, hold on, no, wait a second. Kezia Dugdale hasn't a chance. Kezia.
Well, I think Prime Minister Rajoy has done more to build the support for independence than any Catalonian nationalist has done for quite some time by the way that they have behaved. And I think what we've got now are two fundamental principles clashing, the rule of law and democracy. So you've got the government in Madrid saying this referendum is unconstitutional, we've got to abide by the constitution, and you've got people in Catalonia saying we've just had this referendum, the people have spoken, that must be respected. And this disaster, this complete mess, has all come around because that referendum didn't have the legitimacy that it should have had when the government in Catalonia had a majority to conduct that referendum. The only way that we can get over this impasse, in my view now, is to have a legitimate referendum in Catalonia. There has to be a political, democratic solution to this, and it has to be that referendum that everybody will take part in, everybody will vote in, and then everybody should ultimately respect the result of that referendum.
Okay. We're over halfway through. We must move on. Matt McQuaid, your question, please.
Should smacking a child be a criminal offence?
Should smacking a child be a criminal offence? And the background to this is that it is going to become a criminal offence here in Scotland, correct? I don't know quite when, but it's on the order book and the SNP are supporting it. So in Scotland, smacking a child is going to become a criminal offence. Anne McElroy, do you think that is the right way to go?
No, I don't. For two reasons. One is I think it's too great. I'll take that. Thank you. I got it easy on that one. No, for two reasons. I mean, I remember Tony Blair saying when he was asked if he smacked his children that he had done it and he didn't feel great afterwards. It's usually a sign that you've lost control of a situation. It's it's usually really not your best moment as a parent. But it's something that some parents want to keep as a sanction and others don't. And I think that should be a choice. And I'm taking as an obvious point that there is a line, and it's, I think, a common sense line between that reasonable punishment and abuse. So the other thing that worries me is the passing of laws which are sort of meaningless because they're incredibly hard to enforce. So either the state would have to really be intervening in the life of every family in Scotland, which is unlikely and would be very unwelcome, or you will have an endless argument about what was really happening. And I think when you know that there is real mistreatment, then of course you should be absolutely draconian about it. But parents, on the whole, are good judges of the way they bring up their children. Politicians are not such good judges of the way that we bring up our children.
So, Jean, how will it be possible to impose this law or make it practical in the way that Anne says you won't know what's going on?
Well, let's just be clear, really clear about what's happening. This is a private member's bill that the Scottish Government has said it will not oppose, and I personally support it. And the reason I support it is this. As an adult, there is no defence of justifiable assault if someone hits us. There is a defence of justifiable assault if a child is hit. I don't think that's right. And what this bill is seeking to do is remove that so that children have equity in terms of protection against assault the same as adults. I think that is entirely the right thing to do. I think it entirely chimes with our approach on protecting and nurturing and supporting children, which is what we're trying to do, and I'm sure is the country that we want to live in and bring our children up in.
It's not the only thing you're trying to do, because you're also, though it's it seems to me it's suspended for the moment, have this named person scheme, which there was a lot of criticism of, where an adult from outside the family is given responsible for a child in the family.
Let's just recall where the named person scheme idea came from, and that came from catalogues of abuse and indeed deaths of children, small children, babies and others, where at the end of yet another inquiry about how could that happen, one of the core things that was always concluded was that one agency didn't tell another agency about what they saw going on. And the idea of the named person is to offer that opportunity both for the family to have support, but for the agencies to work properly together in order to protect children. Now, what we have done, the courts made a decision which said that our intention as a government was fine, was correct, but that there were difficulties around how we were going to implement that we had to resolve. And that is what we have gone away and done, and are coming back on that. So I don't think that you can dredge up those issues around named person when the core of it is absolutely the correct thing to do, and say that that's the same and that's a wrong-headed move to go. I agree that parents are the right people. They know their children and they should be able to bring their children up. But I don't think it is right in this day and age for us to have a situation where, as an adult, I am protected, but as a child, I would not be. I think that is wrong.
The woman up there on the gangway, thank you. Yes.
I'm a qualified social worker, been qualified for over 20 years, and every social worker would support that the GAFEC principles about getting it right for every child. But how do you expect social workers to support this? I mean, I'm an advanced child protection professional. I work in conjunction with police a lot. There are laws in place at present to protect children, but in terms of supporting that, when families don't have allocated social workers at the present, when vulnerable people are at risk, it's just unsustainable to have these types of laws and expect professionals to be able to make them meaningful.
You think you would have to make the not smacking law work? It'd be down to people like yourself.
It would have to be effective. It would have to mean something. It's like the law around smoking in cars with children. How is that policed? I mean, whether it's emotional harm, physical harm. I support the principle and I absolutely advocate as a professional that no child should ever be smacked. But policing that and equipping the social workers, you need to have a million more of us to support families to make it meaningful.
Okay. And that man up there at the very back, you say. Yes.
When me and my wife were talking about having kids, I said, right, I'll be the authoritarian and I'll be doing all the smacking. Luckily, my wife talked me round, and I've enjoyed it every year since my children have showed up. I totally disagree with smacking children, but I think the SNP have totally got this wrong, and that this is unnecessary, and we should be thinking about more serious things and getting on with the job of running a government.
I actually think that assaulting children is a pretty serious thing, and what we're trying to do here is to equalise the law. Adults have protection from assault, children currently don't, and I think we have to be very careful about the language that we use here. We're not banning smacking. Your kitchen's not going to be raided by police officers because you've pulled your kid away from a hot pan and tapped them on the bum. That's not what this is about. It's the reality of saying, no,
It is what it's about.
I'm afraid it's not. And can I say to you...
You seem to have lost the support of a lot of people.
Well,
here.
no, look, in the last Parliament, I was the education spokesperson for the Labour Party, and all the children's charities in Scotland came to me and said, we must do this, there are a number of children at risk, it's the right thing to do. And I bottled it because I was so aware of how it would be perceived as people interfering in family life. Much as the debate around the named person thing has become, and what the government's trying to do is the right thing by vulnerable children. This is the argument that we're faced with again, and I think it's a very important move. This is a bill coming forward from a Green MSP. The SNP aren't going to oppose it. The Labour Party are supporting it. I've personally signed John Finney's bill, the guy that's brought this forward. I think he's very brave to. And if in just bringing forward that bill, he forces some people to rethink their behaviour and rethink how they approach their children in a physical way, I think that's a good thing. And I'm sorry if that's not a popular view, but it's my job to stand up and represent and look after vulnerable children in Scotland, and I believe that's what we're doing with the ban.
You, sir.
I mean, you're saying it's perceived kind of influence in family life, and I don't think it is perceived. I think that I'm not a parent. I just got married in July, but I feel like parents are concerned about it, much like the named persons policy. Parents are concerned, so it's like, why should the parents trust the Scottish Government that doesn't seem to trust them to raise their children? I think they're very valid concerns.
Daniel Hannan.
I think there is an immense difference between disapproving of something and wanting to ban it. And in that difference lies the entirety of a free society. I mean, for what it's worth, physical correction of children is in decline in almost every Western country, in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. It's in decline as mores change, as values change, the same way that the earlier question referred to attitudes towards women in the workplace. But what we're talking about here is bringing the full force of law in, as we heard from the social worker lady there, I think the most unarguable objection. This is an unenforceable piece of legislation. So why is it being passed? It's being passed because lawmakers reach for legislation almost always as their first recourse to show what nice people they are, and to show how concerned they are, and to show how they're on the side of the kids and so on, without any thought for the practical unenforceability of it. And the worst possible reason to pass a law is as a kind of state-amplified virtue signalling. We should be proportionate in what we do, and we should recognise that the best unit, not just of conveying values, but of healthcare and social security and education, is the family.
So, virtue signalling, Owen Jones.
Well, I'm worried I'm going to be on the victim of a parents' uprising here, so I'm going to be careful. I do tend to side, I have to say, with the Scottish Government on this. Britain is actually an outlier overall. It's one of only 4 countries where it's legal to do this. In terms of virtue signalling, I don't like that phrase. Virtue signalling is a term which is used against anyone who cares about anything other than just themselves in society, so I don't like that term. I think, though, the idea parents are all going to be locked up and incarcerated under this law is for the birds. I do think it will send a signal that this isn't the right or correct way to discipline children. I think most parents, when they slap a child, would accept it is a failure, actually. And also, I worry that slapping children passes on a message that is the way you resolve problems and difficulties and challenges as adults. So on that basis, I think it works in other European countries. You don't see the mass incarceration of parents over there. I think we should just get into line, if you like, with where they are in the 21st century. I realise I'm in a minority in this audience.
OK. Now, I'm in a difficulty here because we haven't got that much time left, but I want to get in 2 more questions. Let me take this one first of all from Catherine Bryce, please. Catherine Bryce.
Why, as a Scot, should I be in the position of possibly having to pay more income tax than the rest of the UK?
And I should... All right. I should just explain that the First Minister of Scotland today outlined proposals for tax rises, which the government here intends to put across, ranging from 1% to something like 5p in the pound if you're earning over £150,000. But, Catherine, your question is, why should you pay more than the rest of the UK? Is that right? And why do you think you shouldn't?
Well, I think there's other things that could be. Am I being asked to pay more tax because of the amount of free universal services that we have in Scotland that don't exist in the rest of the UK? Are all of these of an appropriate value to justify that? I would suggest some of them aren't. I think some harder decisions need to be made around that.
Some harder decisions about public spending against taxation?
Public spending against taxation, but in particular all these free universal services that we have in Scotland that don't exist in the rest of the UK, like free prescriptions, etc.
And you don't think you'd either not have them or not pay for them?
I don't think I should be paying more tax to get these.
Well, how would you go? OK, Kirsty Douglas, what do you think of it as a proposal?
I'm a bit cynical about this at the moment because I've fought 4 elections against Nicola Sturgeon's SNP where she's opposed raising taxes to protect public services, and the Labour Party's advocated having progressive taxes to invest more in public services. So Nicola Sturgeon stands up today and suddenly says she's all for progressive taxes. I find it a bit rich, to be honest. And the reality is it's because she's lost her majority in the Scottish Government that she's having to cook up some sort of plan, probably with the Greens, to stop us all having to vote again next year. But look, let's talk about what this is really about and why it really matters. We have a decision to make. We are faced with austerity, coming from Westminster, yes, but we now have an immensely powerful Scottish Parliament where we can choose, if we want to, do things differently. That's allowed us to have tuition frees, free personal care, free prescription charges, a mass expansion of childcare, free bus passes. But it's not really free, is it? We're all paying for it. And the price of that has seen a reduction in college places. It sees cancer waiting times running amok, well over what you're entitled to. And these are the choices that governments are faced with. If we want to keep all these free things, if we believe in high-quality universal public services, we have to talk about who pays for them. Now, I pay less tax now than I did 5 years ago because the Tories gave people who earn my wage a tax cut. That's not fair when libraries are being closed and children's centres are getting closed down. Let's choose to do things differently.
Daniel. I mean, I'm delighted that Kirsty got a tax, but so did everybody else. She phrased that as though it was
better, though, does it?
OK, but you were implying that it was only a tax cut.
People can't feed themselves, and I got a tax cut. And you
but
think
just
that's
come back to the main point, which is, as a Scot, hang on, as a Scot, Kezia has made the point why she thinks it's right. Catherine Bryce has said, as a Scot, why should I pay more tax than the rest of the UK? Daniel.
Well, it's good to have a strong relationship between taxation, representation and expenditure. And under the old system in Scotland, there was a limited linkage between those things because the taxation was largely done at a UK level, and there was an imperfect link between what the devolved administration was spending and what it was raising. Now, I look at the referendum result from 2014, and it seems to me the only fair way of interpreting a 55-45 vote is to say, if we're going to build a new consensus, it has to be on the basis of something in between, i.e. more devolution within the UK. It will go too far for some people, it won't go far enough for others, but part of that must be a measure, or a greater measure, of fiscal autonomy in Scotland. And I think that would be a good thing for Scotland. I think it would be a good thing for the whole of the UK, actually, because people, the closer the politicians are who are spending money on our behalf, the more careful we tend to be about it, the more we hold them to account. But if Catherine doesn't like being taxed more for living here, the solution is in her hands. She could vote for Ruth Davidson and have a lower tax, and we could actually have tax competition within the UK and downward pressure on rates. That'd be wonderful.
Or you could move south, I think you said. Owen Jones.
My dad's a very ill cancer patient in Edinburgh at the moment, and the Scottish NHS doesn't have the resource it needs, partly because of a lack of money. And if those at the top of Scottish society end up paying a bit more tax, then that's a good thing, because you can invest in services like the NHS for the good of my dad and no doubt many of your own relatives. The truth is, the reality is this, and this is about Scotland and the rest of the country. A few years ago, the financial elite plunged us into a very, very bad disaster. And they got away with it. They carried on paying more bonuses than every European country put together, whilst working people suffered the longest squeeze in wages for generations. We've had the worst fall in wages now of any EU country other than Greece, where we don't have the housing, the affordable, decent, comfortable housing that millions of people are denied. That NHS in England was plunged into a humanitarian crisis, according to the British Red Cross, where most people in poverty are in work, earning their poverty every single day.
All right, can you come to the point?
This is a social order which is bankrupt, because the richest people in society are not paying their fair share, whilst millions of people are paying for a crisis they have nothing to do with it. But makes them pay more tax.
Okay, but the question, I'll come to you, Jean, if I may, on this, and will you stick to the point about Scotland as against the rest of the UK, which was the question? And if you can appreciate a bit, I'd be grateful, because I want to get one more question in.
Okay. There's a number of reasons, I think, and one of them is the quality of our public services. Please let me finish. And the points that Kezia made in terms of what we receive in return for the taxes that we pay. And those are significant expansion in childcare, free prescriptions, free bus travel, free personal and nursing care, which we will extend to those who are under 65 in certain conditions. Now, what we have produced today is a set of options of what we could do with the limited income tax powers that we have. And, you know, yes, you could vote for Ruth Davidson, but if you voted for her tax options, what you would see is a tax cut for the top 10% of earners and £140 million taken out of the Scottish budget for public services or for any level of expenditure, because that is what the Conservatives are offering. And in Kezia's point, yes, Kezia has argued for this, but what we have said before is that the option that Labour was producing was an option that affected those who were poorly off as well as everyone else, and it was a pretty blunt instrument.
What about the 50p top rate? You opposed that.
We've brought forward a series of options. We've costed what the other parties want to propose, and the idea of this is that we try and reach a shared view in that Parliament about the best way to use those tax powers, meeting 4 important tests. And clearly, if you read the paper, 50% of income taxpayers under any of those options that we've brought forward would not pay more tax.
But the point is, you are not, and this power to increase taxation has been around for a long time. You're not averse to using it and making Scotland a more heavily taxed place than the rest of the UK. That's the nub of the question.
No.
Very briefly. You're not against that.
No, the point of having powers is to use them when you can use them effectively.
Okay.
And we've brought forward a series of options where we believe that people should be able to choose between those in order to have the investment in public services, in infrastructure and in economic growth that Scotland needs.
Thank you. All right, you've made the point. I have to move on.
All the more so, if I may, David, because of the impact of Brexit that was not there over a year ago. That is the case.
All right. The man, I'll come to you, Anne. The man on the gangway there. Yes, you, sir. Quickly, if you would. Yes, you.
Yes. How can we create investment in Scotland, where we're the highest taxed in the UK? It sends out the wrong message.
Anne McElroy.
Well, the short answer to the lady's question really is that the deficit in Scotland is over 3 times what it is the UK as a whole. I mean, this has been a high-spending country. Yes, it is true. And it's a high... you have had
the UK's deficit.
As the UK's deficit, that's what I said. But the point that you're trying to sort of bring out, the lady I think was asking, was in a sense, why should she be more highly taxed? Well, actually, I'm pleased that you're beginning to use tax-raising powers. I think if you've got them, you might as well use them. I wondered how long it was going to take, because Nicola Sturgeon wasn't looking that keen to do so, as Kezia pointed out. I know that you've used them in a limited way, but this is now getting rather more serious, and it is coming through to people that some people are going to pay more tax. So you can either continue to spend at these levels, but what is really missing for me is any talk about, you're talking about superior public services. To be honest, as a former policy editor, I don't really see them in lots of places in Scotland. I think in health and education there are big structural challenges to reform.
Outperforms the UK in health.
Well,
I
would quarrel with you on that, but it certainly does not in education, as you well know. A lot of the results are going backwards.
What's your point?
My point is you can either spend more money and raise more money and go honestly to the people of Scotland and say that that's what you're going to do and you're going to expand that. That, I think, is a good thing. It's a devolutionary principle. But then you have to take it on the chin that people will not necessarily think they're getting value for money, and you need to address why not. Because there is a lack of reform in the public services in Scotland. I don't think it's a big secret.
Can we at least allow the possibility that putting tax rates up is going to diminish revenue, right? When, for example, the corporation tax rate was cut, the amount of money that came into the Treasury hugely went up as business increased its activity. The cut in the top rate of tax led to the richest people paying more in both absolute and relative terms. There comes a point when you put tax up to a level that your revenue begins to fall, and I think that's a lesson that the SNP may be about to learn.
Then on to the last question. Yes, you, sir.
Hi. In 2005, the Kerr report was published. Jean knows about it. She was political advisor at the Labour Party at the time. The report said at that time that the NHS was struggling for money, long before anybody had ever heard of Brexit. So why have 12 years gone by and all of a sudden it's time to make tough decisions? Okay. It's laughable.
And you, sir? Want to come in very quick, if you would?
We can ground all the houses with this, but once again Scotland's been used as a guinea pig. With the dreaded poll tax in the 70s, now we're getting income tax. We're being used again.
OK. We've got a minute left for this last question, but I think we should have it. Alex Young.
Should our present Prime Minister, Theresa May, be replaced by our excellent Ruth Davidson?
OK. I don't know. I would just very briefly. Daniel Hannan is the only Conservative here on the panel.
There are huge numbers of talented Conservatives inside and outside the Cabinet, and Ruth is definitely one of them.
OK. Anne, you want to...
I think she'd be a very welcome Scottish export at Westminster. I think there may be a vacancy. The question is, does she want to leave this lovely land of yours? Because she doesn't seem to... I think she should tell us, don't you?
Owen, very briefly.
I'm sorry, but I don't think it matters who the Tories replace their leader with at the moment.
Jean, quick one if you would.
Well, Ruth is a Tory. I don't think it matters much either, except that I wouldn't have to listen to her waffle every week at home.
Tap that one.
I think she's a marginally, and I say marginally, better choice than Boris Johnson.
OK. Thank you very much. On which controversial note, our time's up.